And thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be joining everybody from wherever you might be coming from today. Thursday afternoon is usually a hectic day here at a newspaper in Israel. Friday's our big newspaper of the week, kind of our weekend edition. So we traditionally have a lot going on, but it's a pleasure to do this together with Beit Avichai and give me an opportunity to kind of think and take a break from the usual routine of what I have to deal with on a Thursday afternoon. And I also thank Beit Avichai for the opportunity to go back to Pirkei Avot. It had been a while, admittingly, since I had opened up that text, and to see what lessons can be learned from there and how can I actually apply to what I do on a daily basis, which is tell stories about the state of Israel, about the Jewish people, about what happens here. But I think particularly now, at a time when everyone around the world, I think, is so much more dependent on journalism, on news reporting, on news organizations like the Jerusalem Post and many others, wherever you might live, whatever you might read, because of what's happening in the world, and because of the need for reliable news information, to know what's happening, to know how are we supposed to conduct ourselves, how are we supposed to behave, what are we supposed to do, what's going to happen, what's going to come. This amazing sense of uncertainty that we all live in today is something that has taken over our lives, really, in for many of us, in an unprecedented way. And I personally think, of course, I'm biased here, but that news organizations like mine play an important role in creating some type of certainty for us to be able to move forward. So if I could ask if is the Mishnah here on the page, on the screen, I'm sorry. Here, Beit Avichai will share it. Okay, so I had the opportunity to look at Pirkei Avot, and there were many different Mishnayot that jumped out. This is very different than what I usually do. I talk a lot about Israel. I talk a lot about my particular expertise over the years has been the Israeli military and different operations, and maybe I'll touch upon that a bit. But it's usually not about teaching Mishnayot. But I guess there's always a first for everything. But what I found is that my experience from going through Pirkei Avot, and sorry, just before we dive into things, I love interaction and questions. So I know there's the chat box. Feel free to write in there. I'll take a look at it every once in a while. So if any of you do have questions, please jot them down and throw them in, and I'll try to get to them as we move along. So don't be worried about interrupting. I'm Israeli. This is Israel, so feel free. And I'll definitely leave also some time at the end to open it up to questions, and we can unmute ourselves and try to have something of a conversation. So my experience has always been, and I've had the opportunity to travel and speak in many different synagogues and temples over on Shabbat and Chagim. And no matter when you open up the Torah and you open up that week's Parsha, or whatever it might be, that week's Torah portion, you'll always find some way to connect it to whatever you're going to talk about. It's the beauty of our Jewish life. It's the beauty of our tradition. And as I looked through Pirkei Avot and was trying to find what exactly is the hook that can connect to what I'd like to talk about, which is journalism in a time of crisis, there were many candidates for the Mishnah that I could potentially use. But I found this one, and I'd like to read it together with you. So Ben Bagbag Omer, Ben Bagbag is our scholar in this case. He says, "Hafochba v'hafochba dekulaba." Turn it over, and turn it over, because everything is within it. Ubata chazeh, you should reflect on it. V'sib ubeleba, and you should grow old and gray with it. Umina lo tezua, you should not move from it. Don't turn from it. She'en lecha midah tova himena, because basically, simply put, there's just nothing better than it. Now, the it that Ben Bagbag talks about is seemingly the Torah, right? The Torah, our God-given text. Just a few words about Ben Bagbag for a moment. When I was reading about this Mishnah, so one thing that I discovered, by the way, is that this Mishnah is actually a popular Hasidic song that is sung by Yaakov Katz, who actually once had the opportunity to hear him perform, quite the performer. Not a bad song, got quite the nice beat to it, if you'd like to listen to it later. But not exactly my style, but still a nice song. But our scholar, Ben Bagbag, he's not very well known, and this is really the only time that you'll see his name. What we do know about him is that he was a student of Hillel Zaken, of Hillel the Elder, and that he lived during the period of the Zugot, of the pairs, as they're known, which kind of touches home for me personally, because I live on a street here in Jerusalem called Rehov Shmaya, Shmaya Street. Now, Shmaya is next to Avtalyon, and Shmaya and Avtalyon were exactly one of those pairs from the time of the Mishnah. And that's the beauty of living in Jerusalem and in the modern state of Israel, is that we can find ourselves living on a street that takes us back thousands of years to the time period of when this text, the Mishnah, was put together. And then we can study it and we can learn it and we can come across these names. And where do you live? I have a delivery guy come up to Rehov Shmaya, and that's the same Shmaya from back in the day. But Shmaya and Avtalyon were a pair, and Ben Bagbag was from that same period. This is the one Mishnah that he's mentioned in Tosfot, a commentary from what's known as one of the Rishonim in the tractate of the Talmud of Chagiga, actually raises the possibility that that Ben Bagbag was a convert. Another commentary that I saw speculates that his name actually stands for Ben is the son, Ben Ger, the son of a convert, or Ben Bagbag, the son of a Ben Gioret, a son of a female convert as well as a male convert. There's another interpretation that I came across that speaks about him as, oh yes, I'm sorry, the Mishnah someone is asking is in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 5 and the 25th Mishnah. So Pirkei Mishnah Chafei, for those who are interested in finding the actual text. The Ben Bagbag was, there's another commentary that was found that the reason his name, this was not his real name, and the reason he went by this name was because during this time period, this was known as the Malshinim, the people who were snitching on Jews or people who had converted from the authorities, and therefore he came up with a pseudonym, which was, in this case, Ben Bagbag. But let's go back to our Mishnah. I'll get back maybe to this concept of ger, of being a convert, of being a stranger, a little later as we move ahead. But let's look back at the text again. So the text tells us, "Afochba dekulaba," right? Turn it over and turn it over because everything is in it, and we should reflect on it. We should grow old with it, gray with it. I don't have much up here, but down here it gets a little gray. And you should turn it over because there's nothing better than it. You should never turn away from it, because there's nothing better than it. And the words are cryptic, right? What exactly is he referring to? What is this it? But the common understanding, as I was learning the Mishnah, was that Ben Bagbag, like I mentioned before, is referring to the Torah. And what he's telling us is that you should just turn it over because everything's inside it. And you should stay with the Torah. You should reflect on it. You should grow old with it there's nothing better than the Torah. Everything that we can find will be in the Torah. Basically, what he's saying seems to be that the Torah is a looking glass of sorts. That no matter what you need in life, no matter what issue you're dealing with, no matter what question you might have, you will always find an answer there. Push aside secular knowledge, push aside secular education. There are questions that come up later in the Talmud of, can we study Greek literature? Can we study Greek philosophy? Do we even need that as a people? Or is just everything, is it enough what we can get and sustain ourselves from the 5 books of Moses? And I think it's almost as if he's explaining to us, Ben Bagbag, this ancient version of what we refer to often today of Dat Torah. Dat Torah can literally be translated as the opinion of the Torah, but it's usually a term that's referenced in more modern times to the way the ultra-Orthodox community, especially in Israel, the Haredim, and we kind of saw this play out recently with the adherence to what rabbis said to them in the beginning of the breakout of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, when universities in Israel were being shut down and kids were being sent home from school, but some of the yeshivas were staying open because the rabbi said they have to stay open. So even when the government says one thing, but the rabbis say another thing, the dat Torah stands, that supersedes everything else. And unfortunately, when it came to the Haredim, that might have led to possibly some of the trouble, I think, that they've encountered with the virus and the greater breakout or outbreak that they've had of the coronavirus in those areas. But that is definitely something that I think comes across in the Mishnah. That's on a very metaphysical level, though, right? Which is that on a deep level, you can find answers to everything you might need in the Torah. It's when I go to a synagogue and have to speak about Israeli politics, I can always find some way to hook it into that Torah portion. When you're looking at Pirkei Avot, as I just did, and these past couple of weeks, looking for that Mishnah, it was right away like that light bulb moment that you find the Mishnah that connects to what you're doing and your existence and what you do on a daily basis as a journalist. And I think you could also read the Mishnah, that's on the metaphysical level, but I think you could also read it on a more practical and literal sense, which is that what Ben Bagbag is saying to us is that you should turn it over, and it's on a physical, practical sense. You really need to look at things from different angles. Because when you look at things from different angles, what you'll also see is that it changes the perspective of how the situation looks and what you might be looking at and what you're thinking about at that exact moment. So when I was asked to think of a Mishnah to learn with you, I dusted off the volume and read through it. And there was one Mishnah that immediately jumped out at me that I thought to learn with you together, which is Hillel's comment as appears in Pirkei Avot of Im ein ani li mi li. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And I actually used that line that ends, that's the final line or sentence in a book I published that came out a year ago that I wrote called Shadow Strike, which tells the story of Israel's bombing of a Syrian nuclear reactor back in 2007, which I think the lesson of that whole story of how Israel gathered this intelligence, the debates that it had at the time, Ehud Olmert was Israel's prime minister. There were sincere and deep debates between Prime Minister Olmert and then President of the United States, George W. Bush, about what the right course of action were to be. But that line of Im ein ani li mi li, if I'm not for me, who will be for me, stood out at the ultimate moment of when Israel had to decide what to do and how to act. And America said, don't attack. Israel said, no, I have to, because this is something that if I don't take action, no one will. And you see that as a thread that kind of runs the course throughout the modern state of Israel, of when we have to make decisions as a nation of what to do and how to act, and pressures from around us. This is how we decide and this is how we act at times. So that was one idea. But then I read on and arrived at this Mishnah, and I think it hit me for a reason, which I'll get to, of really what it means to be a journalist. Ben Bagbag was talking about the Torah, but I think he also could have been speaking about what it's like to be a reporter. He says, turn it, for everything is in it. Reflect on it, grow old with it. Like I said, there's the abstract and the practical, the two different ways to read it. When reporting on a story, a topic, a beat, you need to turn over ideas. You need to think about the issue, and you have to stay with the issue. Right? He says, don't turn from it since nothing is better than it. I started my career back as a journalist in 2002, so almost 20 years now. My first job was actually writing as an update editor on the Haaretz English website. When I got my start, I was a Little League baseball coach here in Jerusalem for my younger brother's Little League team, and one of the fathers one of my team members was a veteran journalist, and I had finished the Army. I had applied to law school at Bar-Ilan University, which I eventually went to, and it took me a while, but I got my law degree. I was looking for something to do for about 8-9 months between finishing the Army and starting law school. And I'd always loved current events. I liked writing, but I really didn't know how. And I spoke with the father of this member of my team and from Little League, and he put in a good word for me. And like everything, a lot in Israel, protexia, right, connections. And I managed to land a job on Haaretz's English news website. Worked there for about a year, but then I started law school, and I was going to be a corporate lawyer, and I was going to make a lot of money and make big deals. And mergers and acquisitions, and that was my future. So after a while, it became too much. I recently gotten married and was now in law school, and was because that was my dream, right? Was to become a lawyer. So I had to quit. I decided to quit Haaretz, and then I went. But then after a few months of just being a law student, I said, "This is not what I want to do." I felt like I was missing something in my life. So I could not go back to Haaretz, and I decided to apply for a job at the Jerusalem Post. And I actually often tell my staff, I started at, I think, what probably is the lowest rung on that ladder. I was also an update editor on our English website at the time, which was pretty much back in 2003, was just taking news that was sent in by our field reporters and putting it online. And thankfully, I've been able to climb up that ladder and be where I am today. But eventually, I became the military reporter for the newspaper. And there's nothing like, and I'll get back to that in a moment, because that was really a formative experience for me and for my identity as a journalist and a reporter. But when you're a beat journalist, when you cover a beat, and that could be military, that could be legal affairs, that could be politics, that could be diplomacy, everything that you do, it's almost like getting a doctorate. It's not in a classroom. You're not sitting and listening to lectures, but you're out in the field and you're experiencing it. It's experiential, it's academic, it's everything all together. And you stay with it. You don't turn from it, but you turn it over and you grow old with it, because that's how it works. There's nothing better than doing it that way. There's nothing better than staying the course of that beat, of becoming that expert, of knowing what you're supposed to do inside out. That's on the abstract level. But I think that also what Ben Bagbag talks about when at least as a journalist is also on a practical level, right? This is the same way it kind of works with the story. You have a story, you have a piece of information, you're not sure where it goes. You're not sure what to do with it. You're not sure how the puzzle comes together, right? So you look at it from one angle, you turn it over, you look at it from a different angle, you got to analyze it. You might see one perspective from this side, but then when you turn it over to this side, you suddenly get a different perspective. You talk to one source, you're looking at the story from this way, but then you talk to another source, and suddenly you're getting a whole new way or concept or idea or thought of how to frame this narrative that's building inside your mind. As a writer, I've always, and maybe this is because I've spent almost a decade covering the military, I've always looked at stories on two different levels as well. There's stories that I think of on a tactical level, and then there are stories that I think that are more strategic stories. More, probably the journalistic term would be enterprise stories. But the tactical stories, I think, are those that you write on a daily basis, right? So those are stories that if I go back to military, those are stories that are an attack here, an attack there, are stories that you have the daily grind of whatever your beat might be, a court decision, a new political maneuver. Now we've sadly, thankfully, I don't say sad, thankfully, it seems we're going to have a government sworn in next week, but sadly for the last 17 months, we had this repetitive cycle of elections, coalition talks, new elections, more coalition talks, another set of elections. So that's part of the daily grind. But the strategic stories, that I like to call them, those pieces, the deeper ones, those are the ones that take time. They go deep. They require, as Ben Bagbag says, reflection. You have to reflect on it. You have to grow old with it. I'm in the middle of writing my column for tomorrow's paper, and I took a break now to be with you. But when I start working on a column, I don't sit in the morning and say, okay, what am I going to write about right now, right? It stays with all week long. From Sunday, Monday, I start saying, okay, what am I going to write about for Friday's newspaper? And it's always in the back of my mind, no matter what I'm doing. I'm in a business meeting, I'm going through over a budget. I'm talking to our printing press about circulation issues, whatever it might be, it's always there. And then it's at different times, it starts to come together. And then you find your peg, you find your story, you find the core of what you're thinking about. You grow old with it, you go gray with it. That's how I work, at least. And it just throws around my head over days until it finally comes to me. I want to connect this to what's the topic today, which is journalism in times of crisis. And I think there's no better example than what has happened in recent months. And that is obviously this period that has really upended this upheaval that is caused to many of our lives by the novel coronavirus. For us at the Jerusalem Post, we've experienced what many other news outlets around the world have seen as well. On the one hand, the extreme difficulty in working at a time like this. Technically, it was not simple. Thankfully, we were able to build the necessary infrastructure and servers that we needed to be able to become a completely remote newspaper with staff, everybody working from home, nobody really coming into the office, and able to continue to produce on a daily basis a print newspaper, which at times was something that had me concerned if we would be able to keep that up. But what stood in my mind, and you can see behind me maybe some of our, this wall shows some of our newspapers over the years, but the Jerusalem Post was not always known as the Jerusalem Post, but once upon a time was called the Palestine Post. It's a newspaper that was established back in 1932 by Gershon Agron, who later became the mayor of Jerusalem. And as many of you, if you live here in Jerusalem, are familiar with Rehov Agron, named for him. But in February of 1948, there was a bombing just outside the Palestine Post's offices. And one person was killed, several were injured, the printing press was destroyed, but that day they still came out with a newspaper. And lahavdil, I don't want to make a comparison necessarily between what we're going on now and what they went through then, but the legacy of this newspaper has always been to continue to produce, continue to publish, no matter what might stand in our way. And that was always in the back of my mind. And just on a technical, practical level, this had been a challenge in how do we continue to produce a newspaper in a time when no one's really inside the office. But then there were questions, I think, that really were more kind of hit the core of what we do, which is what is the role of a journalist in a time of a crisis? What are we supposed to do, right? What are we supposed to write about? Are we supposed to just tell what announcements are made by our prime minister? As many of you from Israel are familiar with, he was giving, definitely in the beginning, those evening lessons of how to hold the tissue and how to blow our nose and how to use your elbow, and namaste he was teaching us in the beginning, right? Is our purpose just to repeat verbatim what he would say? Is our purpose just to publish the regulations and the rules as they were distributed by the different government agencies over time? And it made me think early on back to an editorial that kind of ties in also to this period of time that we're in, that was written by Amiram Nir back in 1982. Amiram Nir was then a journalist for Yediot Achronot, which is probably the most popular Hebrew language newspaper in Israel. And he was actually the husband of a woman whose name is Judy Nir Moses, who now is married to Silvan Shalom, a former Likud minister, foreign minister here in Israel, who had run for the office of president, but did not win a few years ago and then stepped down from politics. Amiram Nir later served as a advisor on counterterrorism to Prime Minister Shamir, and was actually involved in, Prime Minister Begin was actually then involved in the Iran-Contra affair, and died very mysteriously in a plane crash in Mexico many years later. So I don't want to go too much into it, but he wrote in an editorial back in 1982, following Israel's invasion of Lebanon, in what was then the beginning of the first Lebanon War. And yeah, Yehuda, thank you for that question. I will get to that. I appreciate that. The first Lebanon War, he wrote an editorial as the war was beginning, and some criticism was starting within the media. He wrote under the headline Sheket Yorim, silence or be quiet, there's shooting going on. And this is what he wrote in Hebrew, and I'll translate. Achshav en oppositia. Now there's no opposition. In Likud umarach. There's no Likud and there's no labor. In Datiim v'chilonim. There's no religious, observant Israelis v'chilonim. There's no secular Israelis. En ashrim v'aniyim. There are no rich or poor. Ashkenazim or Sfaradim. Ashkenaz or Sephardi Jews. Achshav kulanu am echad b'madim. Achshav yorim sheket. We're now one people. We're in uniform. They're now shooting. It's time to be quiet. So again, there's no opposition. Doesn't make a difference what your background is. There's shooting going on, silence. And that very much became an ethos for the Israeli press and the Israeli media. is a time when boys' lives are being lost. They're laying down their lives and sacrificing them on behalf of the security of the state of Israel. Is that the time to pass criticism, or is that not the time to pass criticism? I say that it fits into this period of time that we're now finding ourselves in, because in just a couple weeks later, I think it's, my memory serves me correctly right now, May 23rd maybe, we will be marking the 20th anniversary since the Israeli withdrawal in 2000 from the security zone that Israel had held in southern Lebanon since the beginning of that war back in 1982. And for those of you who remember that period in time, there were the four mothers and the campaign that finally led to Ehud Barak, who was then the prime minister, to pull Israel out unilaterally from Lebanon. And we could have a lot of discussions about that and the effectiveness and whether it was the right move, and did it not maybe embolden and empower Hezbollah and turn them into that force that we then fought against in the Second Lebanon War in 2006. But this slogan of Sheket Yorim, of quiet, we're shooting, became a slogan that was meant to impress upon Israelis the need for patriotism, for solidarity, and for togetherness during a time of war, a time of conflict. While soldiers are in battle, Amir Amnir was saying, you don't criticize. That comes later, not now. And personally, I experienced this in what was formative for me was the 2006 Second Lebanon War. I remember I actually started in June. I had been invited by the Israeli Navy in June of 2006 to join them on the first time the Israeli Navy was participating in NATO maneuvers off the coast of Romania and the Black Sea. And I convinced my editor at the time, David Horvitz, who's now at the Times of Israel, to allocate me a small budget of a few $100s, pay for airfare and one night in a hotel. And I would fly to Bucharest and then take a train down to the city called Constanta, and I would meet up with the Israeli Navy there. And I joined them on their ship for these NATO maneuvers, which was super cool. One of the more cooler experiences I've had as a reporter. I always say back then I could fly on helicopters, transport aircraft, sail on missile ships, submarines. Now I get to sit in an office. But we all have different periods in life. But I was on the ship, and on Shabbat I spent in Constanta, ate my meals on the missile ship with the Israeli sailors, and then Sunday morning we set sail to join those maneuvers. And after we left the dock and started the maneuvers, that same Sunday morning was when terrorists from Hamas crossed into Israel through a tunnel and attacked a tank parked along the border, and abducted a soldier by the name of Gilad Shalit, who was then held inside Gaza, as you'll recall, for 5 years. So I was able to get off the ship, get back after I was supposed to spend 5 days with them. I only spent about 2 days with them. I moved up my flight, was able to get back to Israel, and went straight down to the border with Gaza, because this was the first large-scale offensive that Israel was launching against Hamas in Gaza since the Israeli pullout just a year earlier in 2005 under the disengagement plan. And as you recall, 2 weeks later, on July 12th, 2006, two reservists, I remember I was driving down south that morning to, again, meet up with the Army for some briefings. And then I get a phone call, Yaakov, head up north. Something's going on the border with Lebanon. Turn around the car, start driving up north, and the details start to come in as I'm in the car of two reservists who had been abducted along that border. And the war breaks out. And as the war breaks out, Ehud Olmert and his cabinet decide to strike back, to try to change this paradigm that had existed for 6 years. If you recall, back in May of 2000, when Israel withdrew from Lebanon, just 5 months later, in October of 2000, Hezbollah crosses into the Har Dov, the Mount Dov, or the Sheba Farms as they're known, area in the north, and abducts 3 Israeli soldiers, whose bodies are only returned several years later. But they had created some level of deterrence. They were along the border, and they were there, and Israel was always afraid to respond and to react. And Olmert decided, and I think in that initial decision was a right decision, even many years later, to try to change that paradigm and hit back Hezbollah. And if you recall, the people who lived in Israel at the time, or even observers from afar, we rallied behind the government in the beginning. You can look back, and I did this for the purpose of our conversation today. I look back at his approval ratings, Ehud Olmert, right? In the beginning of the war, it was over 70%. Right? This is a prime minister who, remember, ends up going to jail corruption charges. It was over 70%. There was a feeling that Israel was finally hitting back Hezbollah, was finally going to change and create security along its borders. But as the war progressed and the death toll increased, numbers dropped to 48%. By mid-September, the war ended on August 14th, which happens to be my birthday. That's when the ceasefire went into effect. But his approval ratings had dipped to already 22%. As the media, we saw the war, and I think I can speak really on behalf of many of the journalists who were covering at the time. In the beginning, it was as if we were in the government's pocket. We were enlisted almost like a miluimnik, like a reservist. Questions were set aside. Questions like, what is the goal of this war? Is the IDF ready for this war? What are the strategic objectives of this war? What's the exit plan of this war? Many of you might recall that Olmert comes to the Knesset, speaks there, and says we're going into Lebanon, we will recover and retrieve the Israeli reservists who had been abducted. That was a far-fetched objective that was already at that point not realistic. But the media itself was not asking those questions, was not challenging the government at the time. And as the death toll rose and the missile fire continued, ultimately 4,300 rockets would rain down on northern Israel throughout that 34 days of fighting. The complaints from the reservists started to come in about the faulty equipment, about the problems with the orders that they were getting. And then the war ends without a clear victory. Hezbollah is still there. Yeah, they're weakened, but we lost 122 soldiers, over 60 civilians. The north had been turned into a ghost town. And the war was considered to have been just as a war that was needed to protect Israel, but the management of it considered to be faulty across the board. And I think there's a reason why this happens. It happens because many of us journalists, and I speak about myself, I often get asked, what do you do when you're presented with the conflict of writing something that's negative about Israel, or writing something that could potentially have security ramifications for the state of Israel? And I think that this is an issue that many Israeli journalists grapple with. Because yes, we're journalists. Our job, and I strongly believe, is to hold our government accountable, is to ensure that there is transparency, is to be what journalism is meant to be, which is the watchdog of democracy. But at the same time, many of us are soldiers. Until recently, I was still doing reserve duty. So where do you draw the line? I'm a father of 4 children. Where do you draw the line and say, we're not talking about something abstract, far away, that doesn't touch my life or affect my life. It's something that could quickly, very quickly, impact the life, not just of my own, but of my children, of my family, of my neighbors, of my community. And is it good for my country to be publishing information that sometimes could be looked at in a negative light? And I think there's no real simple answer to that question. I think it's a complicated one that every journalist needs to ask and grapple with on an individual basis. But I think that what I said that this was a formative experience for me, because what I saw during the Second Lebanon War was that afterwards, when the war came to an end, many of us were asking ourselves questions of, if we had maybe asked those original questions earlier on, would lives have been saved? Would those operations have continued in the same way that they did? Would maybe one soldier have returned home alive as opposed to in a coffin? I don't know, and I don't want to say that journalism has this miraculous power. That's not my point. But I think that it makes you wonder what your role is in all of this and what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to conduct yourselves. So I take us back to COVID-19 for a moment. I think that Israel, by the way, has come a long way since the Sheket Yorim, the quiet, we're shooting period of 1982. And many of you who read newspapers and consume Israeli-centric media on a daily basis, we know how to bite, and we bite hard, right? And that's across the board. You could just ask our prime minister. He thinks the entire media pretty much is aligned against him. But we don't hold back on a daily basis, but times of emergencies are often viewed very, very differently. It's one thing to criticize your politicians on a daily basis. It's another thing when people are dying and when there's a real sense of an emergency that's out in the air. So with COVID-19, when, for example, we as a newspaper questioned why the prime minister would hold statements I counted, he held 14 of them without taking any questions. Some of my readers, and we called for him to take questions. We thought that in a democracy, there's no supreme leader. You represent the people, you have to answer to the people. The representatives of the people in this case are journalists. They have the right to ask questions and to challenge these statements that you're making on a daily basis. What are you afraid of? Why are you not taking questions? Some of my readers told me to back off. Now's not the time to pass that criticism. I remember writing about the failure that I felt, and we were hearing, and many of you might be familiar with as well, in the increase in testing. Over about a month and a half ago, almost 2 months ago, the government said that they would be at 30,000 tests a day. Well, we pretty much never crossed the 10,000 mark, right? Which everyone spoke about how testing is a key to get out of this pandemic and lockdown. Or the transfer of authority to the IDF. There's no, whether we like it or not, there's no institution in Israel society like the defense establishment that has the capabilities to be able to maneuver and move and logistically get things done the way that the defense ministry and the IDF can get things done. If you think back, at every point when there was a problem, it was the military that was called in to try to help solve that problem. The first time was when if you think to Bnei Brak, when they had to close and lock down that city, who's called in to bring them food? The IDF soldiers. When there was the problem with the old age homes, nursing homes, who was called in to lock those down and make sure that people don't visit? The military. And on and on. But why weren't they called in earlier? And there were political fights that were going on between the prime minister and the defense minister, Naftali Bennett. When we were asking questions about why was what's known as the Mateh Hasbara Leumi, the National Information Directorate that had been set up as a lesson of the Second Lebanon War to synchronize and synergize between all of the different spokespeople of this government, why was it not being used? We were also told, now's not the time for those questions. There's a war going on. People's lives are on the line. You don't ask those questions. But for me, and I'll give you just one last example. You might remember earlier on when the government, in the middle of the night, held a vote and decided to use the Shabak, the Shin Bet, the Israel Security Agency, which is Israel's equivalent to some extent of the FBI, its counterterrorism agency, to track civilians. What many people were concerned of a significant and severe invasion of privacy, which, by the way, I favored. I still think it was the right move to use it, but without any oversight, without passing it through the different legislative bodies that we have, like the Knesset, that would ensure that there's oversight, that this information is not being used against Israel citizens, because sadly, we could find ourselves in that situation. We, like many other newspapers, we actually were part of a petition that also helped get the Supreme Court to open up, and if any of you were watching this week, the Supreme Court hearings that were aired live on TV and on Facebook, I'm proud to say that we helped play a role in making that happen. So there is our belief, and my personal belief that I can speak mostly about, is that the role of the media, and again, I go back to the Second Lebanon War is what was formative for me personally. The role of the media is to ask those questions early on, is to ensure in a time of crisis that there's oversight, there's transparency, and that the government, whichever it is that leads us, is held accountable. Our job, as I believe it, is not to applaud the government, not to stand on the side and say what an amazing job they're doing. When credit is deserved, we should be giving it. But it is to ensure that our governments stay sharp. It's to keep them on their toes. It's to ask those questions to make sure no one lives in an illusion to believe that every decision will be perfect. Mistakes will be made. And especially in a time of crisis, when you have to move fast, there will be a lot of imperfect decisions and answers that are given. But it's our job, as I see it, to ensure that they stay the course and that they are sharp and they know that someone's watching, right? The Sheket Yorim of 1982, as I believe, is not as relevant as it once was. I wonder, for example, had we pushed harder back in the Second Lebanon War, would things have maybe looked differently? And I don't know. And it doesn't help to, spend too much time on the past, but it's a lesson that definitely influences the way we act, or the way I act as the editor of a newspaper currently in the future. And lastly, but possibly just as important, I think, there's the need to counter fake news today, which is something that is out there. It exists. It's unfortunate. Sometimes our politicians use it. They're the ones who are disseminating it. They're distributing it. Are we always going to be perfect? Of course not. but can we try to ensure that our readers are getting the reliable information? Because that's what it's about. It's not about us. There's another saying in the Mishnah that talks about Kol ha'omer davar b'shem omro mekarev ha'tagula. Everyone who says something in the name of someone else brings closer the redemption. You think about that for a moment. Why is me quoting someone who told me something bringing the redemption closer? By the way, as I say this, I should be quoting one of my editors here who gave me this idea, Udi Shacham, is the fact that it's not about me. It's not about us as reporters. It's not about our ego. It shouldn't be, at least, right? It's not about our byline. It's about getting readers the accurate, reliable, trustworthy information. Now, that's changed over time. Today, it is, sadly, a lot of it is about the personality behind it, right? If you watch the news, it's about the reporter who's telling you the news. It's about so-called, whatever his or her name is, breaks this story. It's not about the story. It's about the person breaking the story, or it's about the story. Which one is it? Do people really, are they looking at the byline? Are they not? I think it has to be about the stories that we're telling, the accuracy and the reliability of the information that we're trying to get across. And finally, and then I'd be happy to, I want to open it up to questions, but I want to mention one last point that I think comes up from this Mishnah, which has been sitting on my mind for some time. I mentioned before how Ben Bagbag was a ger, apparently, according to our commentators, and he was the son of a convert, and a female and a male convert. One of the lessons that we have in Judaism is to accept the other, right? Is not what we're told constantly throughout the Torah, that we should always remember to treat the ger like one of us, the convert like Bnei Yisrael, like the people of Israel, because we knew what it was like back in Egypt, not to have been like the masses, like the majority. We knew what it was like to be the other and different. And Ben Bagbag was an example of that. I was watching on Yom Ha'atzmaut and Israel Independence Day the Bible quiz, the Chidon HaTanakh, which is a festive ceremony of when children, kids, teenagers from around the world come together from the United States, South Africa, South America, Europe, and of course Israel, to answer questions about the Tanakh, about the Bible, about the different verses, who said what to who, in the book of Judges, in the book of Yoshua, in the book of the prophets, Nevi'im. Amazing. Some of these kids, what they know blows my mind, and I'm a graduate of many years of Jewish day school and yeshiva, and I have never heard of many of this stuff. But there was one of the hosts at the time, whose name was Shalom Core, who's a known linguist here in Israel, said to, there was one point, for example, a young man from Teaneck, New Jersey, a contestant in this contest, in this quiz, was being asked a question. He wasn't smiling, and Benny Gantz, who still serves before he takes up his new role as the deputy prime minister, is now still the chairman, the speaker of the Knesset. So he was there in that capacity, and he said to Avshalom Kor, why is he not smiling? So Avshalom Kor says, he has no reason to smile, he's in the exile. There were a couple other comments like that Avshalom Kor made, of referring to the Jews who live outside of Israel as living in the exile. And I was thinking to myself, first of all, besides for just being mean to these young teenage children, kids, who are competing at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., wherever they might be around the globe, in a contest that definitely probably has them very pressured, nervous. Last thing they're probably thinking about is how they're going to smile, is just this dismissal, rejection of the other, of that other person, of not accepting them. Saying that they live in the galut, in exile, is to say that their life is imperfect, that there's something wrong with the life that they live, that it's not as full or the way it should be, like the people who might live inside Eretz Yisrael, inside the land of Israel. And that use of semantics, which you might say, Yaakov, move on, don't be caught up on it, but I am caught up on it because I think it does transmit an important message of how do we respect the ger, the other, that other person. And I think it ties into this period of time that we're currently finding ourselves in, after and during this virus and this pandemic, which is when and probably many of you saw, but when I watched Israeli soldiers from elite infantry units march into Bnei Brak, a stronghold of ultra-Orthodox Jews, of Haredim, to deliver food, to go door to door, and to bring them packages, it moved me. Because I know that on a daily basis before then, if they go into that city, they could be cursed on or spat on. When I watched that video that I'm sure many of you saw of an Arab nurse in a geriatric ward in an Israeli hospital chant Manishtana on the night of Passover Seder, on the night of Pesach, for the patients there, it brought a tear to my eye. When I saw an Israeli Arab doctor cradle a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, for the patients in a coronavirus ward, you couldn't but get the shivers and the chills from the emotional experience of seeing that happening. And I think that what we've seen over these last few weeks, these last few months, is what Israel is meant to be, is what Israel is meant to be as a country, as a nation, as a democracy, as the democratic Jewish state, of how we can come together, how the different people in this country can come together, the Ben Bagbags of all of us, because to every different person, we are a Ben Bagbag. We're different. We're strangers. We don't always come together, but this brought out, I think, the beauty in all of us. The Rebbe Mikutz, the Kutzker Rebbe, a Hasidic master, has a line that he says, "Ein shalem milev shavur." There's no whole than a broken heart. And I think that that's what we've experienced throughout the time that we've had over these last few months during COVID-19 and during any time of crisis, is that we know how to come together. The question is, can we take that forward? Can we ensure that the Ben Bagbags that are still out there will know that they have a place, that they are respected, that we all are actually one, even in times of crisis? So I want to thank you all very much. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'd be happy to take questions. Yehuda Lavi, or Lev, if I just pronounce it right, writes here in the chat group, as a journalist with a historical perspective, can you touch how everyone followed the instructions for the first time in history? The healthy were quarantined instead of the sick, and the damage to the economy. Look, I think it's a great question. And there's something I'm writing about for tomorrow, so I'll give you the sneak preview. But we've all heard, for example, and the Prime Minister repeated this Monday night when he spoke about, we had kind of maybe some of you watched I call it the graduation ceremony from coronavirus, was that big festival that was held at the Prime Minister's office, that hour and a half long press conference. By the way, first time that he took questions, so I got to commend him and give him credit for that. But he again compared us to Belgium. Now, we were often compared throughout this crisis to Belgium, as well as to some other countries, but Belgium in particular, because Belgium has a population of about 11 million people, and Israel's just over 9 million people. So more or less, pachot hayoter, we're about the same size population. And if you look at their death toll, sadly, it's already over 8,000 people, while in Israel it's 239 people earlier this day. I hope it hasn't changed since then, but that's what I saw just a couple hours ago. So why this stark difference? Now, I think that the comparison is faulty for a number of reasons. One of the fact is that we don't have land borders here in Israel. Belgium has Germany to the Netherlands to the north, Germany to the east, France to the southwest, Luxembourg to the south. It's surrounded, and under the Treaty of 1985, there's no borders, there's no checkpoints. You just cross and you go wherever you want. We don't have that here in Israel. There's no border crossing with Lebanon or Syria. With Jordan, barely there's any movement into the country, as well as the same with Egypt. So with the snap of a finger, you shut down the country. One of the earlier decisions that was taken was definitely to stop the flights into Israel, which was very smart, very important, and saved a lot of lives. But the other thing is, and this is what's important, is the fact that we as a people here in Israel, let's give ourselves some credit. We are experienced with states of emergency, right? When how many of you have had to pull their car over to the side of the road? Has happened to me a number of times, because a red alert or air raid siren is going off, and you got to jump down out of your car, duck down, put your hands over your head next to your wheel or in a ditch, and just hope and pray to God that that rocket that's coming off right now towards Tel Aviv, wherever it might be, is not going to land near you, right? We know how to do that. We know how to go into a bomb shelter. We know how to put on a gas mask. We know how to look, how not to get on a bus or to stay away maybe from coffee shops. We know how to look suspiciously at bags when they're left on the corner of a street, because it might be, as we call them in Israel, chifetz chashuv, a suspicious object. We know how to call the police. Just yesterday, there was one right outside my office. That's on a daily basis. We've all seen hundreds, if not thousands of this on a daily, all over the country, because that's how we live as Israelis. And that's ingrained inside our DNA. So to Yehuda's question of the success that I think we had here, well, first of all, we also respect our family is the value of life within Jewish tradition is something that can't be diminished, right? Something, right? Everyone who saves one life is as if he saved the entire world. So to lock down just the elderly or those in high risk and to let out the masses, we do this because we value human life, I think, more than your average country and more than your average people. Sometimes, by the way, that plays to our disadvantage, right? Look at the price that we paid. I mentioned Gilad Shalit before. The price we paid as a nation to bring back a single soldier was releasing over 1,000 Palestinian terrorists with blood on their hands who went back, sadly, to their old ways of terrorism. But we do that because that one soldier means so much, right? So I think that the Israeli people have that ingrained DNA of how to conduct themselves and how to follow those orders. You say to someone in South Florida, hey, you can't go to the beach, they look at you like you're crazy. You say to someone in New York, you can't go to Central Park. They've never had that, maybe after 9/11. But it's not something that's been ingrained in their culture and society in such a way. Nachum wrote to everyone, Shadow Strike's a fascinating book. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Nachum. Andy, your last question is the real question. Why this time as opposed to other times will we continue to behave with the kindness and appreciation of other that we did during this time? As you said, in times of crisis, we unite in the biggest. Look, this is our problem, right? We suffer as people. We suffer from amnesia, right? I think it's a common human trait that we've probably all experienced in some form of one way or another. But if you've ever had a loved one or a family member or you yourself who has suffered from a very severe illness, as an example, in your mind, because I've had that, you never think that it's going to hit you, it's going to happen to you, but it can. But why, if we recognize now that it can happen, then we'd all walk around depressed. The point is that there's something healthy about being able to move on. And I think we should move on. And hopefully we'll get out of this crisis, no matter this pandemic, no matter where we are in the world, and be able to come back, maybe not to the way we used to be, but to this new normal that will currently exist with the masks that we have. My new rules in the office is you got to wear masks no matter where you are walking throughout the office. And we all got the alcohol gel next to us. I use this stuff, too many times during the day. But the point is that we should go back, but we should also recognize what we saw throughout this experience. And I hope that we can. I genuinely hope that we can, because that's what we should be as a people. That's what we're supposed to be. I have Nurit who's raised her hand. So Nurit, feel free to maybe unmute yourself and ask a question. I'd be happy if you'd like to do it by voice. Nurit, you want to try again?
No.
We can hear you.
Mistake. No.
No? Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Anyone else? Any last questions before we finish? We got 5 minutes left, so feel free if there's anything. Otherwise, as your lecturer, I can let you out early. I guess there's nothing. So I want to thank you all. Thank you, Tamar. Tamar will have one last comment for us. So before we sign off, I want to thank all of you for joining me today. It was really a pleasure to be with you. And this series has been a lot of fun for me personally as a speaker to really go back. I don't often have the time or the bandwidth to read through Mishnayot and Pirkei Avot. I probably should. You're supposed to find more time. So I'll take that as a lesson for life. But so I want to thank Beit Abichai for forcing that upon me. Deb Solo asked, when can we expect you to learn with us again?